So today we're going to be talking about cut paper. We're also going to be talking about how to establish a focal point. We're also going to be discussing shape in regards to your cut paper assignment. There are several types of shape that we're going to be working with, the first of which is geometric shape. Within geometric is rectilinear and then also curvilinear types of shape. This example is a rectilinear type of shape where it's all formed by straight lines. It can be infinitely variable. You can have shapes within shapes within shapes. But rectilinear tend to be very angular, very hard-edged shapes. And thinking about how do you want to use that or how do you want to manipulate it. Curvilinear shapes are also in the geometric family, and they're made up out of curved lines. If you have a compass, you could use a compass to draw some of your lines for the project. Organic shape is our third type of shape. Organic shape is derived from nature. For your project, what I would suggest that you do is to find botanical or natural illustrations. Photographs tend to be a little bit tricky because there's value, there's color, there are some things that kind of impede your ability to look at shape. Um, but I would suggest Ernst Haeckel's work, which you can easily Google, in terms of how to look at what that organic shape looks like. In this example, you can see that there is lots of shapes within shapes. It might be that you don't like the overall shape, but it might be that you really enjoy kind of an interior shape or a smaller shape. Um, so Haeckel's work is really great because you can kind of deconstruct it and utilize maybe you like the shapes on the outside, maybe you like the shapes on the inside. His work has lots of different ways to kind of view it. In my example that we'll be looking at for the project, I'm going to be tracing a botanical illustration. So medical illustrations, botanical illustrations, natural illustrations, all of those things I think would be particularly helpful in looking for organic shape. Amorphous shape is a shape that's a little bit ill-defined. In this example by Norman Lewis, you can see that shape isn't very clearly designed. Um, defined. So it's a little bit more hazy in some ways. It might be something that feels a little bit organic, but doesn't quite fit into one category or the other. It's a little bit more of an ambiguous shape. So these are the types of shapes that you're going to be working with in your next project for cut paper. The other thing that you're going to be working with in your compositions is establishing a focal point. There are several different ways that you can establish a focal point, the first of which is directional line. So here you can see all the lines kind of come together to indicate where the artist wants us to look. So here the focal point, of course, is the head of the figure. And those lines, those rectilinear lines, are leading up to kind of this organic shape. Even kind of the legs or the arms are all kind of pointing to that figure. Directional line can be established in several ways. In Jordan Casteel's paintings, there's a really strong sense of diagonal, but then there's also kind of a line that's created by the bag that's leading up to the hands, and then there's also directional line in the coat that is then leading to the hands, which are the focal point of the piece. Um, Here in this example, you can see kind of the nails are pointing towards the focal point, but then also directional line can be established by psychological lines. So there's a psychological line that's being formed from the figure looking at the phone. Psychological lines are created by oftentimes figures that are doing something. So in this sense, we're connecting what the woman is doing with what's happening in her hand. So there's a directional line that's being established by psychological lines. In this example, all of the shoes are pointing inward in Willie Cole's piece with a heart of gold. But then we're also going to be seeing contrast as a way to establish a focal point as well. Every single one of the shoes is pointing into that focal point that's being established in the middle. Here in Elliot Erwitt's piece, you can see that there are all these directional lines leading into that focal point of where the boy lines up perfectly with the crack in the glass. And then focal point can also be established through contrast. So here you can see that it's a fairly busy composition in terms of different types of fabric and pattern and movement. It's a very energetic piece, but there's a very clear focal point that's occurring where you have that orange circle on top of the green, pushing it forward in terms of color contrast, and then that leading us down into the face and forcing us to look at the face. Um, Mickalene Thomas is doing the same thing here. We're using color contrast. So the yellow on top of the blue is forcing our eye into that focal point. Here, she's doing the same thing, but in terms of content. So our eye immediately goes to what's contrasted, which would be the eyes. They line up fairly well, but we can see through the cut marks and collage that the two do not belong to the same photograph. And because of that contrast, we're drawn right there to her focal point. Focal point, like I was just talking about, can be about color. So here you can see that the foreground and the background, there's a swath kind of painted through it to draw our attention to the figure in the foreground. Contrast can also be established by scale. You can have a very large object and a very small object. And it can also, in our cut paper assignment, be contrasted by, is it organic? Is it rectilinear? How do the two shapes relate to one another? So here you can see that these three black shapes are neatly balanced with the red shapes because the red shapes are smaller, they're more active. Um, they're at an angle, which activates the space a little bit more, but then they're also painted red. So the red is then counterbalancing the black of the other shapes, which are larger, but the red is taking up more visual space because of the intensity of the color. In this example, Irwit is definitely playing with scale as a way to bring your focal point. And then you can also have conceptual uses of contrast to bring you to that focal point. So here you can see in terms of content, all of the men are looking at a nude lady in the painting, and then the woman is singled out as looking at the woman who is fully clothed. And so in terms of concept, there's a strong contrast between the two. Um, you can also have multiple focal points throughout your composition. Here you can see because our eye is drawn to the facial area, that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 focal points that we're looking at in this composition. Um, there's a clear focal point in the middle because it's a portrait and we're going to be looking at the woman's face, but then also the records in the background also create focal points as well. Here you can see we have at least 5 focal points that are happening through scale, through contrast. So if you have multiple focal points, thinking clearly about what is the intention, how do I want that to function? And then the last thing that we're going to be talking about today is cut paper artists. Your project, you will need to have a positive area and then also a negative area. So something that's cut out of the black paper, and then also something where you're playing with where is the white appearing and then where is the black appearing and how do you want to balance those two. So we're talking about a reductive process and then also an additive process. Kara Walker's work very much plays with the idea of silhouette. Her work very much addresses the history of slavery in our country and through multiple facets. One of which is to really utilize narrative as a method for discussing, I think, very uncomfortable elements about slavery and our continuing relationship to how that is continuing to be resonated in today's society. Her work is large scale. Many times we're working with figures. Like I said, there's absolutely kind of a narrative element to it. But you can see that shape is also a really, really important part of what she works with. Here I want to draw your attention to not just necessarily kind of the intricacy of Emma Van Leest's work, but also the use of patterns. So you'll notice that pattern is kind of playing up in some different areas. In your project, you'll need to transition from organic shapes to rectilinear shapes. And I think this is a really nice example where you've got all of these rectilinear elements in the buildings being contrasted by the organic shapes that are occurring in nature. And she kind of does this over and over again. So here you can see that she's playing with what areas are positive and what areas are negative. You want to be thinking about the orientation of your paper for the project. Is it vertical? Is it horizontal? How is the visual flow going to happen throughout the piece? And then in Van Leest's work, she very much works from one single piece of paper. You can also play with developing pattern as an element of your project as well. So I'm drawing your attention to organic line. I'm drawing your attention to rectilinear line. How do you play with shapes within shapes? That's another way to add another layer. Emily Hogarth's work, you can see that she has really strong elements of organic line, but then within that, she also is then repeating over and over again patterns of organic line to add more depth. And Chris Natrop's work very much is playing with amorphous shape. They almost feel like paint splatters. That's something that you could do a paint splatter and then trace over and then draw. And here you can see it's a really nice relationship between these very amorphous shapes flowing into these organic shapes where you can recognize flowers and petals and other organic shapes that are occurring. And even though it's in color, we can easily imagine what this would look like with black paper. Um, Ayoma's work very much plays off with very, very intricate details, but it's beautifully balanced with heavier shapes. So the intricate details would be a little bit too overwhelming, a little bit too hard to kind of view, unless you didn't have these really nice kind of heavy black shapes kind of balancing it. And here you can see the same thing. So don't feel like everything has to be this incredibly detailed thing. You can have a balance between shapes cut out of other shapes or kind of what amount of detail you want to have in some areas. Beatrice Caron's work very much plays off of a narrative, but you can see that thinking about the amount of black paper or white space that you might have versus very intricate areas. So don't be afraid to kind of have negative or positive space in your compositions and how you want to be thinking about that. In Yuda's work, very much the human figure is oftentimes referenced, but then once again, you've got these very complex areas, but they're counterbalanced by some more solid areas. So you want to be making decisions about what do you want the piece to feel like? How do you want it to transition? What kind of things are you tracing? What kind of things are you working with? Is there a sense of flow to the work? I have had students, kind of base their shapes on just organic shapes in terms of human anatomy. A lot of human anatomy is very organic in nature. Or maybe they're mainly looking at botanical specimens, or maybe they're looking at marine life, or maybe they're looking at animals. So there's so many different ways to kind of play with it. Nikki McClure's work has been around for quite a while. All of her work is cut out of one single piece of paper. And once again, kind of that balance between negative and positive space. Um, and then also the use of pattern as well. Some students do really beautiful cut paper projects where the majority of it is just the black paper with a little bit of the white paper showing, and you absolutely could do something like this. And then you want to be thinking about like, and this is a great example of the positive and negative relationship where you definitely have positive areas and the negative areas coexisting in the same space. Um, some students like to approach this in terms of three-dimensional elements. So sometimes students, especially because we're going to be photographing to document these, you will need to glue these down for your assignment, but it might be that you want to pull some areas up and play with a three-dimensional element. Maybe you want to light it in some different ways. This you can see is the paper kind of going in different directions. And then you can also play with depth as well. So here in this example, you can see that Bowden is layering things as well. Here I just find all this tiny detail really fascinating. And you can layer. So it might be that you want to take some more Bristol paper, add some white to it, have another layer of black, have another layer of white. It just depends on how you want to think about it. This gives you a sense of the scale of her work. And then you can also see patterns kind of repeating. And then I like to be kind of obnoxious and throw in Rogan Brown's work, which is just incredible in terms of the amount of detail. I'm not expecting any of you to do this, but it is incredibly kind of inspiring that someone takes the time to make all these teeny tiny, beautiful, exquisite little details out of cut paper. And then you can see that they're layered in different ways. And then, of course, depending on how you light it, that can certainly change the intention of the work. So lots of examples in terms of cut paper, thinking about your focal point, and then also thinking about shape. So you guys have a lot to think about for your next assignment.